1983. A cassette tape sits on a desk at Atlantic Records in New York. It's been sitting there for 3 days, unopened, just another demo in a pile of hundreds. INXS has been trying to get an American record deal for over a year. They've been rejected by every major label. Atlantic passed on them once already. But someone in INXS's Australian management convinced Atlantic to at least listen to one more demo, just one more chance. So the tape sits there, and on the afternoon of the third day, an A&R executive named Bob Krasnow picks it up. He's not expecting much. He's heard 1,000 bands that all sound the same. But he pops the cassette into his player anyway, and 4 minutes and 30 seconds later, after hearing the first song, he picks up the phone and calls Australia. We need to talk about this band. That cassette tape, those specific songs, and that one phone call changed everything. This is the story of the demo that finally got INXS signed to Atlantic Records, the songs that proved they belonged on the world stage, and how persistence in the face of constant rejection eventually paid off. Let me take you back to where INXS was before that demo tape, because the rejection and struggle is part of what makes the eventual success so meaningful. By 1983, INXS had released 3 albums in Australia. INXS in 1980, Underneath the Colours in 1981, and Shabooh Shoobah in 1982. In Australia, they were doing well. They had a following, they could sell out clubs in decent-sized venues. Songs like Just Keep Walking and Don't Change were getting radio play down under. But Australia is a small market. If you want to be a truly successful band, if you want to reach millions of people and make a real living from music, you need to break America and Europe, and that's where INXS kept hitting walls. Their Australian label, Deluxe Records, had distribution deals that got INXS albums into American record stores in limited quantities. But without a major American label behind them, without real marketing and radio promotion, those albums went nowhere. College radio stations would play them occasionally. A few music journalists who paid attention to international rock wrote positive reviews, but mainstream America had no idea INXS existed. The band knew they needed a proper U.S. deal with a major label that had the resources and connections to break them nationally. So, starting in 1982 and continuing into '83, INXS's management started shopping them to American labels. They sent packages with albums, press clippings, photos. They arranged showcase performances when INXS toured the U.S. as an opening act for other bands. They made phone calls and sent telegrams and did everything possible to get label executives to pay attention. And label after label said no. Warner Brothers passed, Columbia passed, RCA passed, and Atlantic Records, one of the most prestigious labels in rock history, the label of Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones, they passed too. The reasons were always vague. Not right for our roster. Don't hear a hit. Australian bands don't sell in America. It was demoralizing. The band members were starting to doubt whether international success was possible. They'd pour their hearts into their music, create songs they believed in, perform their asses off in tiny American clubs for crowds of 50 people, and still the major labels weren't interested. There were conversations about whether they should just accept being a successful Australian band and stop chasing the American dream. Maybe it wasn't meant to happen. Maybe they should be grateful for what they had. But their management, particularly Chris Murphy, who managed INXS throughout their career, refused to give up. Murphy believed in the band absolutely. He knew they had the talent, the songs, the charisma, the live show. They just needed the right person at the right label to actually listen with open ears. So he kept pushing. And in mid-1983, he got Atlantic Records to agree to listen to one more demo. Not a full album, just a cassette with a few songs. If Atlantic liked what they heard, maybe there'd be a conversation. If not, that was probably the end of the road for an American deal. Now, choosing which songs to put on that cassette tape was crucial. INXS and their management knew they had one shot. Whatever songs they picked had to represent the band at their absolute best. They had to show diversity, prove INXS could do more than one style, and they had to have at least one undeniable song, something so good that even a skeptical A&R executive would have to acknowledge it.
After much debate, they selected 4 songs from their existing catalog. The exact track list has been reported slightly differently in various interviews over the years, but the song everyone agrees was on there, the song that made the difference, was The One Thing. The One Thing was from the Shabooh Shoobah album, released in Australia in October 1982. It was a perfect INXS song in many ways. It had that driving, funky rhythm that made you move. Michael's vocals were confident and charismatic. The hook was instantly memorable. The production by Mark Opitz was clean and radio-friendly without sounding generic. And the lyrics, while not particularly deep, had that combination of sensuality and yearning that Michael did so well. Well, you can look at me and see the darkest sky, but I promise you I can take you high, the one thing you're searching for. It was a song built for American radio.
The other songs on the demo cassette likely included Don't Change, which was INXS's biggest Australian hit at that point and showed they could write anthemic rock. Possibly To Look at You from Shabooh Shoobah, which had a new wave edge that was popular in the early 80s, and probably one other track that showcased either their harder rock side or their more experimental tendencies. The goal was to show range while leading with The One Thing as the obvious single. That cassette was packaged with a brief letter from management explaining who INXS was, their Australian success, their touring history, and why Atlantic should take a chance on them. Then it was mailed to Atlantic Records' New York office, addressed to Bob Krasnow in the A&R department. And then came the waiting. Days went by with no response. INXS was back in Australia, trying to stay busy, trying not to obsess over whether this last chance demo would lead anywhere. Management called Atlantic a few times to follow up, got vague responses about "we'll get to it when we can." Bob Krasnow has told the story of listening to that demo in a few interviews over the years. He was a veteran A&R executive who'd worked with major artists and had good instincts for what could be commercial. But he was also skeptical by nature, having heard countless demos that went nowhere. When he finally popped the INXS cassette into his player, he was doing paperwork, half paying attention. The first song started playing, and about 30 seconds in, he stopped what he was doing and actually listened. By the time The One Thing finished, he rewound the tape and played it again. Then he called his assistant in and played it for her. Then he called another A&R person. By the end of the day, multiple people at Atlantic had heard the demo, and the consensus was the same. This band had something. Bob Krasnow picked up the phone and called INXS's management in Australia. The time difference meant it was the middle of the night in Sydney, but he didn't care. He reached Chris Murphy and said words to the effect of, "Tell me about this band. I want to sign them." Murphy, who'd been fighting for this moment for over a year, could barely believe what he was hearing. They talked for an hour about INXS's history, their vision, what they needed from a label. Krasnow was enthusiastic and committed. Atlantic wanted to sign INXS and release Shabooh Shoobah in America with proper promotion and marketing. The band was ecstatic when Murphy told them. After all the rejection, after all the doubt, someone at a major American label finally got it. Someone finally heard what they'd been trying to communicate. Atlantic Records, one of the most respected labels in music, wanted to work with them. It felt like vindication for every difficult tour, every small club performance, every frustrating rejection letter. The deal was negotiated over the following weeks. Atlantic would release Shabooh Shoobah in America with The One Thing as the lead single. They'd commit to radio promotion, music video support, and tour funding. INXS would come to America for an extended promotional tour. The contract was signed in late 1983. Shabooh Shoobah was released in America in early 1984, and The One Thing was serviced to radio stations across the country. The response was immediate. American radio programmers loved The One Thing. It had that new wave energy that was popular, but with a rock edge that mainstream stations could embrace. MTV put the music video into rotation. The song started climbing the charts, and suddenly INXS was being played on major radio stations in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, everywhere. The One Thing peaked at number 30 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the summer of 1984. That might not sound like a massive hit, but for an Australian band's first American chart appearance, it was huge. It proved INXS could compete.
What's important to understand is that without that demo tape, without Bob Krasnow actually listening to it, none of what came after would have happened. No Atlantic deal means no American promotion for Shabooh Shoobah. No The One Thing on American radio means no breakthrough. No breakthrough in '84 means no opportunity to make the swing with Nile Rodgers. No swing means probably no chance to make Kick 3 years later. The entire trajectory of INXS's career, all the success that followed, traces back to that cassette tape sitting on a desk in New York and one A&R executive deciding to give it a real listen. Bob Krasnow has said in interviews that signing INXS was one of the best decisions he made at Atlantic. He recognized early what millions of fans would eventually discover, that INXS had the complete package. They could write catchy songs, they could perform live at an elite level. Michael was a star frontman, and they had that hunger, that drive to succeed that separated good bands from great ones. Krasnow's willingness to trust his instincts after hearing that demo gave INXS their chance. The band never forgot how many times they'd been rejected before Atlantic said yes. It kept them humble even as they became successful. Michael would reference it in interviews, talking about how close they came to giving up, how one person believing in them made all the difference. Andrew Ferris talked about the lesson he learned, that persistence matters, that you can't control whether people give you a chance, but you can control whether you quit. INXS chose not to quit, and it paid off. There's something almost mythical about the power of a demo tape in music history. The Beatles' first recordings, Bruce Springsteen's early demos that got him signed to Columbia, countless bands whose careers hinged on getting the right person to listen to the right tape at the right time. INXS's story fits that tradition. They weren't an overnight success. They'd been working for years, honing their craft, building their catalog, but they needed that one opportunity, that one open door. The Atlantic demo tape was their door. It's worth noting that not every song on the Shabooh Shoobah album was as radio-friendly as The One Thing. Some tracks were more experimental, more challenging, but The One Thing was the perfect introduction to INXS for American audiences. It was accessible without being generic. It represented the band's strengths without revealing all their complexity. It got people interested enough to explore the rest of the catalog. That's what a great single does, and The One Thing did it perfectly. After the success of The One Thing, Atlantic released Don't Change as the second American single from Shabooh Shoobah. It didn't chart as high, but it further established INXS on American radio. By late 1984, INXS was a known quantity in the U.S. They could headline mid-sized venues, they got interviews on rock radio stations, music magazines wrote about them as one of the exciting new bands to watch. The groundwork was being laid for bigger things to come. The Swing album in 1984, produced by Nile Rodgers and featuring Original Sin, built on the foundation that The One Thing had created. Atlantic promoted it heavily, knowing they had a band with momentum. Then Listen Like Thieves in 1985 went gold in America, and then Kick in 1987 became a phenomenon, selling over 10 million copies worldwide. But none of that happens without the Atlantic deal, and the Atlantic deal doesn't happen without the demo tape. Chris Murphy, INXS's longtime manager, deserves enormous credit for refusing to accept all those early rejections. He could have said, well, we tried, it's not meant to be, but he kept believing in the band, kept pushing, kept making calls and sending demos and arranging showcases. Management doesn't always get acknowledged in success stories, but good management can make the difference between a band reaching their potential or fading into obscurity. Murphy's persistence directly led to that demo reaching Bob Krasnow's desk. For aspiring musicians, the INXS demo tape story offers both inspiration and practical wisdom. The inspiration is that rejection isn't permanent. Every no just means you haven't found the right person to say yes yet. The practical wisdom is that your demo matters enormously. The songs you choose, the quality of the recording, the presentation, all of it influences whether someone will actually listen with attention. INXS didn't just throw together any 4 songs. They strategically selected tracks that showcased their strengths and led with their best material. There's also a lesson about timing and persistence meeting opportunity.
INXS had been making great music for years before Atlantic signed them. They didn't suddenly become a better band in 1983, but they kept working, kept creating, kept putting themselves in position to be discovered. And when the opportunity finally came, when Bob Krasnow listened to that demo, they were ready. They had the catalog, the live show, the professionalism to capitalize on their chance. Looking back at 1983 from the perspective of 40-plus years later, it's almost impossible to imagine a world where INXS didn't break internationally. They seem inevitable in retrospect, but they weren't inevitable. They were extremely close to remaining an Australian-only band, a footnote in rock history rather than a major chapter. That cassette tape, that one last demo, that 3-day delay before someone listened to it, any number of things could have gone differently, but they didn't. The tape got listened to, the band got signed, and rock history was changed. The physical cassette tape itself, the actual object that sat on Bob Krasnow's desk, probably doesn't exist anymore. Cassettes were disposable, especially in the music industry where thousands would pass through an office every year. But its impact is permanent. That tape is why there's a Kick album. It's why Need You Tonight exists. It's why millions of people around the world know Michael Hutchinson's voice and INXS's music. Objects can have enormous historical significance even when they're physically insignificant. When INXS toured America after The One Thing started getting radio play, they noticed the difference immediately. Crowds were bigger, people knew the songs, there was real enthusiasm rather than polite curiosity. Michael felt it on stage, that connection with an audience that knows your music and came specifically to see you. That's what every artist wants, and INXS finally had it in America. And it all traced back to that demo, to that phone call, to Atlantic Records saying yes. The story of the INXS demo tape is ultimately a story about never giving up on something you believe in. INXS believed in their music, their management believed in them, and even after countless rejections, even when it seemed hopeless, they kept trying. One more demo, one more submission, one more chance for someone to actually listen. That persistence, combined with genuine talent and great songs, eventually broke through. It's a reminder that success often comes not to the most talented people, but to the talented people who refuse to quit. 40 years later, The One Thing is still played on classic rock radio. It's still streamed by new generations discovering INXS. It was the song that opened American doors for an Australian band that had been knocking for years. And it exists on American radio because a cassette tape finally reached the right ears at the right time. And one person had the wisdom to recognize what he was hearing. That's how careers are made, how history happens, how persistence pays off.